All right, let's dive into what is a really critical moment between the United States and Iran. It's this high-stakes standoff, caught right between a potential breakthrough deal and the very real threat of military conflict. So let's get into what's actually happening. The stakes were set, and in the starkest terms possible, when the president was asked if a limited strike was on the table, his response? I guess I can say I am considering that. Well, that sends shockwaves everywhere. When you publicly say military force is being considered, the whole situation shifts from just diplomatic chess into a direct, open threat. So, we're left with this really confusing picture. On one hand, you hear whispers from diplomats that a deal could be just days away. But on the other, you have the president himself openly talking about a military strike. Is this all part of some grand strategy, or is it just a massive contradiction? Let's break down what's actually happening behind the curtain. Okay, first up, the art of coercion. To really get what's going on, we have to understand the strategy at play here, which, involves both threats and talks. This is a pretty textbook example of what's called coercive diplomacy. The basic idea is you use the threat of force to get your opponent to change their behavior. But, and this is the important part, for any of it to work, the threat has to be believable. That's exactly why the U.S. has been moving its naval forces into the region. It's all to make sure that when a strike is mentioned, Iran knows it is a very, very real possibility.
And this is where the strategy gets so dangerous. You have to ask, are these moves just a tactic to pressure Iran into a fair deal, or are they actually the first steps toward a war? Experts say it can be both at the same time, because the actions, like moving an aircraft carrier, look exactly the same, no matter what the final goal is.
So why are these talks so difficult? What's the holdup? Well, it really boils down to a fundamental disagreement. The U.S. wants to talk about everything: Iran's missile program, its ties to armed groups, the whole shebang. But Iran is insisting that any deal has to only be about its nuclear program. And that's the stalemate. That's the core issue that has everything completely deadlocked.
All right, Section 2, Anatomy of a Limited Strike. So let's talk about the military option. If the diplomacy falls apart, what does a limited strike actually mean?
Limited strike. It's a phrase that sounds so clean, almost surgical. But what does it mean in the real world? What are the actual military options on the table right now?
Well, the military assets in the region give the president a whole range of choices. You could have strikes from submarines, which are incredibly hard to detect. You could have airstrikes from aircraft carriers, or even missiles launched from other naval ships. Each one of these options carries a huge amount of risk and, honestly, a very high chance of things escalating out of control.
Okay, Section 3, Allies, Agendas, and Israel. It's so important to remember the United States isn't acting alone in all this. To get the full picture, we really have to understand the role of key allies, and specifically Israel.
Yeah, this crisis is not happening in a vacuum. This upcoming meeting between the U.S. Secretary of State and the Israeli Prime Minister, that's a huge signal of just how coordinated things are. Israel sees Iran's nuclear program as a direct threat to its existence, so it's a given that any potential U.S. action would happen in very close consultation with them.
And this kind of collaboration is nothing new. It's really deep-rooted. It's been reported for years across different administrations that the U.S. and Israel have jointly planned and even war-gamed military scenarios that target Iran. This just shows you how deeply involved Israel is in shaping the American approach here. Moving on to Section 4. Power, presidents, and Congress, because its international crisis is also creating a big constitutional showdown right here at home, and it's highlighting that age-old tension between the power of the president and the authority of Congress when it comes to war. This brings us to a really tricky constitutional gray area. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, plain and simple. But it also names the president as the commander-in-chief of the military. And throughout history, this has led to presidents taking military action without ever getting a formal declaration of war from Congress. And that is exactly where we find ourselves right now. Congress has not given a green light for a strike on Iran, but, and this is the key, it also hasn't passed anything to forbid it. This creates this kind of ambiguity, this policy and political vacuum that the president is now operating in.
Okay, Section 5, Countdown to a Crisis. So all of these different pieces, the diplomacy, the military buildup, the allies, the constitutional questions, they are all coming to a head right now in what really feels like the final days of this standoff.
And President Trump has put a number on it. He's saying he believes 10 to 15 days is all it should take for Iran to make a deal. And that, of course, puts immense pressure on absolutely everyone involved.
Which brings us right back to the central question, doesn't it? Is this deadline a real window of opportunity for diplomacy to work, or is it an ultimatum? The final warning shot before those military options are put into play.
So, this is where we stand. Negotiations have stalled out, the military is ready to go, a huge political debate is raging in Washington over who even has the authority to make the next move. It's an incredibly tense situation, and frankly, the entire world is watching to see what happens next.
And all of this leaves us with one final thought. The United States is speaking with its power, through its military might and its diplomats. But in this final countdown, is that power being used to deliver a warning, or is it a promise?